is Paula, and this is my story. So my mother is from Switzerland. She immigrated here in the 60s, and her family goes back many hundreds of years in Switzerland. Probably tell the story of my grandpapa Jules. He was my great-grandfather. When he decided to marry my great-grandmother, he bought a clock. And at that point in time, this is around World War I, when you found the one you wanted to marry, you went and bought the nicest household thing you could find. And so he went to this horologist, who are clockmakers, and bought this clock. And the gentleman apologized and said, you know, it's World War I, it's not going to go very well, they probably won't last very long. But he liked it and he took it. And he always took care of that clock. He wound it faithfully, he kept it dusted and clean. It had the place in the living room where you took the nice guests and the minister. And so that clock has been in the family since then. It is coveted in our family, and it now hangs in my living room.
What prompted you to create the book?
So what prompted me to create this book was my mother's dementia diagnosis. She was diagnosed with visual variant Alzheimer's. If there's anything that's good about Alzheimer's, is that in the early stages, the very far back deep memories start coming to the surface. And Mom was starting to do this. I went to visit Mom one day, and she just suddenly started talking about her childhood, about these memories, and they were so sharp and very vivid. And I immediately went and bought a digital recorder, and I told my dad, whenever she starts telling these stories, you turn on that recorder. And so he did, and I ended up with hours of stories. I learned a lot of new things with this book. I learned so much about my mom and her childhood and my ancestors. Never knew just how much my great-grandfather Jules raised my mother. This was wartime, and my grandmother and my grandfather were just trying to get food on the table. And they were busy all day long, morning to night. And Grandpapa Jules, who was a very typical Swiss male, very traditional, don't normally raise children, and he became a puddle around my mother and really took care of her when she was little. So that was a really neat story to hear, that the great Grandpapa Jules was actually in a big old softie.
My name is Pam, and this is my story. I was married to a really wonderful, incredible gentleman by the name of Bob Cupp, and he died in 2016 after a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. It was very quick, 4 months. He had a life history creating things. He was a designer of golf courses, but he also painted and he sculpted and he did blacksmithing. And one of the early projects that he had was when he was in the Army. He served in the Army early 60s, way before I ever met him. And we had in our house photos of this project that he had done to commemorate the Army's centennial in Alaska. So Robert E. Cupp served in the Army. So he was a young man who was living in Miami, had originally from central Pennsylvania, went to school at University of Miami. And of course, when you do ROTC and then you're officially in the Army, they send you to Alaska. And then, you know, he got transferred to take on this project of celebrating the Army's centennial in Alaska. And he created these images. To the best of my understanding, they were painted on tent material that he had stretched. And we have one of these at home. We have one image, which I don't know if it was ever really in the original, but it's the one that we have, and it's tent material that he stretched. And it's just sort of interesting to think about how he pulled all the pieces of what was the Army to create this celebration of the centennial. And supposedly, sitting in state houses around Alaska, the images still exist. He could sit down and draw anything. But there was so much more that went into it, and the thought that went into it, and the effort that it took. You will never regret the effort it takes to sort of pull together some little piece of your family history, whatever that is, and really pulling it together so you've got something tangible that will help both trigger the memory as well as put down the memory so that it's not lost.
My name is Cindy, and this is my story. This is a book of memoirs with me remembering my childhood in the 1950s. And the first part I began to remember was summer. And summer in Ohio was hot and humid long before the days of air conditioning. And so it was spent pretty much outside in the yard. And some of my fondest memories from those times are catching lightning bugs in glass jars with holes poked in the top. And I'm not sure why my mother didn't think they were terribly dangerous, but she didn't. And we ran around the yard carrying glass jars to catch fireflies. My mother had a master's in microbiology at a time when most women didn't have master's degrees. And so she was kind of the neighborhood person that everyone would go to with any pseudo-medical ailment. If anyone in the neighborhood had a splinter, they would come to my mother. If anyone in the neighborhood needed to have a tooth pulled, they would come to my mother. And she had all these home remedies that she would use. I remember if you would have like a splinter that she just couldn't get a piece of it out, she would take an egg, and a raw egg, and crack it open. And there's a very fine membrane inside the eggshell. And if you pull it very carefully, it will come out in one piece. And she would put that on the splinter, and as it would dry and tighten, it would pull the splinter out. Most vivid memory is probably when I would get a chest cold and she would make a mustard plaster. They were incredible. I don't know what the chemical reaction was, but she would take a clean dish towel and she would spread on it, I believe it was dry mustard, and maybe it was vinegar. I'm not altogether sure. The recipe's in here, I'd have to look for it, but it would create heat. And she would put that on your chest, and it smelled, and it burned, and it worked.
What prompted you to create the book?
My grandchildren go to a wonderful school, and every year they have something called Grandparents' Day. And the headmaster of this school is a man who always gives a speech to all the assembled grandparents, and there are lots of us. And he always does it with humor, but this time he spoke with great seriousness about the fact that we have stories to tell that our grandchildren have no concept of. And if we don't take the time to write down these stories, then when we're gone, they will be lost with us. But the interesting thing that happened was that what became initially a story of memories very quickly became a journey into trying to understand how I've become the person that I am. And what I came to understand as I was writing this, it was an incredible experience for me, was that much of who I am today came from experiences in my childhood. And that those experiences were never profoundly felt at the time. They seemed simple and maybe even unimportant, but together, the mustard plaster and the affection that the neighborhood children felt for my mother and all of these other stories that evolved became a journey to understanding why I am who I am. It's been a profoundly moving experience for me.
My name is Barry, and this is my story. Having a family is really one of the critical aspects. It's about being belonging. And remember, there was one cousin who actually, for some very convoluted reasons, wasn't aware that he was part of the family until he was like 20. And when we were able to include him, he was so excited and so, enthusiastic about being part of something that was larger than him.
So tell us a story from your book.
Then I like to play sports, and in both Springfield and Dayton I played football, and I ended up being captain of the team, and it was a team that was an exceptional team. And that was one of my interests in the book. I thought, no one's going to know about my playing football if I don't how recorded. So, and there is a picture of the book of me that made the Dayton Daily News in my football uniform when we were playing for the championship game. And that was one of those life adventures. It was unusual and exciting, and that I wanted to be sure that my grandchildren and their children knew about.
And what about the impact of the book?
The first comments when I called cousins and told them that I wanted a story, we had two things. Ronnie called cousins and told them he wanted money, and I called cousins and told them I wanted pictures, but the pictures were not enough, that I wanted stories. And there was some, I'm not sure I want to do that, and then I'd have to cajole them a little bit and talk to them. And then, of course, people like to think about themselves, and no one wants to be left out of a project. But then, when we had the party in Atlanta, and we probably had 100 people in that party, one person after another. First of all, when we passed out the books, they just started looking through those books. The tables couldn't get them up for a while. They couldn't believe it. Not only their own stories, but then the stories of other family. And then they would come up to me and say, this was so much more worthwhile than I thought. And I am so excited about having this book. And, no families exist without some conflicts. And there were people at this party that had been conflicted with each other. Well, I didn't hear any of that. The most complaining, difficult members of the family, when they saw the book and were able to enjoy it, just talked about how meaningful it was and how glad they were able to do it. And, it's what I saw is that they recognized that their stories were important, and now they were in something that's going to be permanent, that's going to be carried on.
I'm Jiffy Page, founder and owner of Pixorium, saving and sharing the photos and stories you love with the people you love. Let me start that again.
Everybody had to serve in the war.
Go. Hey.
Hi.
Coming back around.
Okay. Except for the damn leaf blowers. Is there anything else you'd like to say that I haven't asked you about yet?
Granddaughter said to me, Grammy, I love this book. And she said, I think when mommy's your age, she should write a book like this. And when I'm your age, I should write a book like this. I can think of no greater family legacy than to have generation after generation of my family write books like this.